All right, so today we're jumping into a huge what-if scenario. We're going to tackle one of the most tangled relationships in the Western Hemisphere, you guessed it, the US and Cuba. And we're asking a really provocative question. What if the US could strategically flip Cuba? Pull it away from China's ever-growing influence. Let's unpack how something like that could even be possible.
So, to really set the stage here, let's start with this really jarring question that's been floating around in strategic circles. After a U.S. move on Venezuela, who's next? Now, let's be clear, this isn't a prediction. Think of it more as a mental framework, a way to get our heads around the immense pressure building up in the Caribbean, the kind of pressure that could push a country like Cuba to make a really dramatic choice.
So before we even get to that what if, we have to understand what's actually happening in Cuba right now. And honestly, it's dire. We're talking about what experts are calling the most severe crisis in the island's entire history. This isn't just a rough patch. This is the kind of extreme, nation-breaking pressure that can force massive geopolitical shifts to happen, and happen really, really fast.
And this really is a perfect storm. It's not just one thing. You've got these deep, structural economic problems that have been building for ages. Then, bam, the pandemic just crushes their tourism industry. On top of that, you have crippling U.S. sanctions. The result? Well, it's exactly what you'd expect. Severe shortages of everything. Food, medicine, fuel, and these endless rolling blackouts. All of this is stoking a level of public anger that hasn't been seen in generations.
And here's the human toll, and this number is just staggering. Almost 1 million people have left the island in just the last 3 years. I mean, think about that. That's nearly 10% of the entire population. It's the biggest exodus in Cuban history, period. And that kind of mass migration puts incredible pressure, not just on Cuba itself, but on the U.S. and the whole region.
So you've got this crisis in Cuba, and the country is pretty isolated by the U.S. Well, that creates a classic power vacuum. And guess who's more than happy to step in and fill that void? Yep, America's #1 strategic rival, China. So let's take a closer look at what that actually means on the ground.
Okay, and this is where it gets really serious from the U.S. national security perspective. We're talking about count them, 4 signals intelligence sites that China is running in Cuba. I mean, this is the core of modern spycraft. They're potentially listening in on communications just 90 miles from Florida. Florida, home to some of the most sensitive U.S. military bases, that is not good.
And make no mistake, this isn't some passive thing. It's a full-blown strategic partnership. You've got the Cuban president meeting with Xi Jinping in Beijing. China is talking about taking military ties to a new level. They're donating critical stuff like power generators that Cuba desperately needs. And maybe most importantly, Cuba has joined groups like BRICS, that political coalition specifically designed to be an alternative to the West. The ties are getting deeper and deeper.
All right, let's bring this back down to the human level for a second. To really understand why a U.S. offer might be so tempting, we need to get a clear picture of what daily life is like for the average Cuban right now.
So I want to show you a few really stark comparisons. On one side, you have the reality of the embargo. For instance, 375 heart patients couldn't get the Medtronic pacemakers they needed, just unavailable. On the other side, the potential of having a relationship with the U.S. We're talking direct access to cutting-edge, life-saving American medical devices.
And it's the exact same story when it comes to medicine. Think about vital cancer drugs from companies like Merck and Bristol-Myers Squibb. They're incredibly hard to get. But with a new relationship, you could have reliable supply chains for treatments that literally mean the difference between life and death.
Okay, now let's talk money. Right now, Cuba spends an extra $1.2 billion just because it has to buy things from so far away. But think about this. A shipping container from Houston would cost 80% less than one from China. Just let that sink in. A change like that would totally transform the price of food, of goods, of everything for the average person.
Okay, so that's the grim reality on the ground. Now, let's get back to our thought experiment. What if the U.S. looks at this whole situation, the crisis, China moving in, and decides to do a complete 180? What if, instead of pressure and isolation, the U.S. offered partnership and investment?
And here's the thing. A tool for this kind of play might already exist, at least on paper. It's called the Americas Act. This is a real bipartisan bill that's been proposed in Congress. And its goal is super clear. Counter China. How? By creating this huge fund. We're talking up to $60 billion to convince companies to move their factories and supply chains out of China and back into our hemisphere. It's basically designed to be a direct competitor to China's big Belt and Road project.
Now this is the absolute key to our scenario. As it's written today, the Americas Act specifically excludes Cuba. But our thought experiment imagines a world where a U.S. administration makes a really bold move. It offers Cuba a special path to join if they make certain changes. That's the big what if we're exploring.
So, how would this actually work? I mean, what would it really take to completely flip the script on a relationship that's been hostile for more than 60 years?
Well, we can break it down into 4 basic steps. First, the U.S. actually makes the offer. Step 2, and this is a big one, the U.S. would have to take Cuba off the state sponsor of terrorism list. That designation is what freezes them out of the entire international financial system. So, step 3, once that's gone, Cuba can suddenly get loans and access U.S. markets. And finally, step 4, money from something like the Americas Act starts flowing in, creating real jobs, and pushing Chinese influence out.
But you might be asking, why would Cuba's government ever go for this? Well, this quote from the Quincy Institute really nails the logic. It's simple geography and economics. The U.S. is Cuba's natural partner. The amount of trade, tourism, and investment America can offer is just on a completely different level than anything China or Russia could ever bring to the table. For Cuba, it's a lifeline, a powerful off-ramp from their current crisis.
Okay, so let's imagine this whole scenario actually happens. What does the world look like then? How does the geopolitical map of the Caribbean totally change?
For the U.S., the win is huge, and it's crystal clear. This chart says it all, really. You take a situation where Chinese and Russian influence is high, and you flip it. Their influence dries up, and it's replaced by American economic partnership. And remember those Chinese spy stations we talked about? Well, a deal like this would neutralize that threat, right on America's doorstep.
And for Cuba, the benefits will be absolutely life-changing. We're talking about everything we just compared. Access to modern medicine, food and goods that are actually affordable, real investment in their power grid and infrastructure. It would be a huge boost for their new private sector. But most of all, it would finally give the Cuban people a real way out of this nightmare economic crisis.
So it all comes down to this one central question, doesn't it? This whole idea is a massive gamble. It would require both Washington and Havana to get over 60 years of hostility and deep, deep mistrust. That's a huge ask. But as we've seen, the potential payoff for both sides is just enormous. So could shared strategic interest actually be powerful enough to undo all that history, or is the past just too strong to escape?